Good evening and welcome. Tonight we are going over the history and geography of Balv in Latvia, which I'm pretty sure I said Lithuania in my last video, which I apologize. They're a little easy to mix up. They are right next door to each other after all. But our municipality of Latvia does not border Lithuania. It actually borders Russia, which is very important to its history. Like pretty much the entirety of Latvia, this area is very flat, it's very wet and marshy, with lots of lakes, little tiny lakes, and little rivers going through. Beautiful, beautiful forests, all overgrown and green and lush. It's very beautiful to see on Google Earth, which unfortunately we're not going to be doing tonight. I'm going to throw my Latvia playlist right up there so you can see the other times that we explored Latvia on my tablet. But sadly, there just really aren't enough places with good pictures to show you in this area to justify grabbing the tablet and showing you around. There are some neat little places. There's a neat garden here in Balv that I'll tell you about. And I found a little sculpture park in the woods right about here, where it's all very bizarre and fairy-like, very Latvian. I feel like every time I explore Latvia on Google Earth, I'll find a slideshow that starts off very beautiful and just kind of gets eerie and creepier as you go through in that kind of like fairy, spooky kind of way. It's very hard to describe, but it's a lot of fun. Latvia is neat that way. Maybe next time we'll get to look at the tablet. This town is actually quite similar to the last town that we visited in Moldova. It's almost the exact name with the exact pronunciation style. That was Balt. This is Balv, with that weird silent I at the end, I guess, emphasizing that last syllable. And they have a lot of shared history, which I want to say, I'm pretty sure, because I researched these places like all together in a lump. I'm pretty sure I put some facts in the last video about Moldova that are actually about Latvia. But given the very closely intertwined history, it could be true as well. No one called me out on it, so it might have been, but we'll get to that part in history when we get to it. Let's get started about what I could find about the history of this place, which was not very much, and because every website I found that had the history of this town and this municipality was the same paragraph copy and pasted, and I hate when that happens. There are some with slight deviations, but for the most part they are all the same. So I'm going to try to piece that together with the history of Latvia, because this region was once part of Latgalia. The people here are still called Latgalians today. In fact, there's a statue here in Balv of a Latgalian soldier for World War II, commemorating the resistance movement. All the sources I read said that the first mention of Balv was in 1224, and I'm not quite sure what that means. I couldn't find what it was mentioned in, but I'm assuming it was some sort of document or whatever from Europeans who were traveling into the Baltic states here, looking to convert. This was the last corner of Europe to convert to Christianity. It was still pagan up to that time. So I wonder if it had something to do with maybe like the Teutonic Knights or some Catholic organization. I'm not sure. That made mention of it first. But that's the earliest anything I could find about Balv. This area was eventually ruled over by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which would eventually be replaced by Sweden after Sweden went out in wars, which would eventually be replaced by Russia after Russia beat Sweden in a war and took over its territory. The first modern, I suppose, house was built in Balv right before the Russians took over. It would have been in 1765 and was built for a Polish noblewoman. After Russia took over in 1772, it was taken over by what I assume is a rich aristocratic Russian family on order of Catherine the Great, which is interesting because the place we just did in Moldova was built up by a Russian Tsar, and the first big settlement here was ordered by a Russian Tsar. You see what I mean? The little similarities. It's quite serendipitous, to be honest. But this town was not really built up into a town until many, many centuries later, long after Imperial Russia had fallen in 1918, and Latvia wound up gaining independence. It was about a decade after that, in 1928, that Balv officially became a town. And I assume all the other little towns here started to develop around then as well. Because before that, I'm sure it was just forest and wilderness. Times were about to change drastically, however. In the late 1930s, Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which we also discussed in our last video, wherein the Soviets and Nazi Germany said, let's pretend we just had a war and the dust settled. Let's draw our lines and decide what we would take. And this area fell under the Soviet sphere of influence. So Soviet Russia came into Latvia and took it over, just as if there had been some great war and it had won the country in the spoils of war, as it did for all the other Baltic states here, Estonia and Lithuania. But that would end quickly, as in 1941 Germany would invade Latvia. And they came in here to the town and actually quite horrifically massacred the Jewish population here. There's a little forest just outside of Balv that they led them to. And to keep it safe for YouTube and for relaxation purposes, let's just say all those Jewish people did not leave that forest. Very devastating. There's a memorial there today for those people, built by their surviving family members. It's really sad. But that was not the last disaster to befall this town. In 1944, as the Soviet army was advancing to recapture this area, the Nazi Germans burned the town to the ground, which might have been the fact that I confused in the last town. Because while that last town was burned to the ground an odd number of times, like way too many times, I'm not sure if it was burned to the ground at the end of World War II. It was at the start. But I might have just read that fact and put that there in the other video because it had been burned down so many times. But maybe it was burned down at the end of World War II. Maybe I'm right. I don't know. But Balv definitely was completely ransacked as the Nazi army retreated and the Soviet army swept in. The Soviets, of course, saw that as an opportunity to rebuild the city in its own brutalist style, very industrialized. And it was here in the Baltic states in the 1980s that a peaceful resistance began against the Soviet Union called the Singing Revolution, which is my kind of revolution because it was all about gathering together to sing and hold hands and spread peace through music and art. The Soviets weren't quite sure what to do because they weren't being violent. It wasn't a full-blown, rah-rah demonstration. It was just people singing. It got to the point where the 3 Baltic states formed a human chain across the 3 countries and everything. It was very impressive and really put the world's eyes on this corner of the Soviet Union at the time. And the Baltic states managed to, in a sense, peacefully negotiate their way out of the collapsing Soviet Union by 1991, right before everything went down in Moscow and the Soviet Union ended for good. What happened to that original home that began in this town, that essentially started the town? Today, it's a neat little complex that is mostly a high school today. But on those grounds, you can find the Regional Cultural Museum, which just sadly doesn't have that great of pictures for me to show you. And it also has the Bear Garden, which used to be the fruit orchards of the manor, and is now an art sculpture park with lots of bears around, lots of big stones arranged and in very interesting ways. And you can find one of the world's largest wind chimes there, which is pretty cool. And that's essentially where we are today. I would encourage you to search it on Google Earth yourself and see if you can find any other slideshows that had interesting things around. A lot of pictures were just the same photo over and over again, or pictures of people's cars or things like nothing too exciting to show you, which is so sad, like I said, because Latvia is so beautiful. So, I don't know how to describe it other than fairy-like. I get that scary feeling you get in the woods sometimes, like you're being watched, but not by like a dangerous individual, but like something supernatural, I get those vibes when I'm looking at pictures of forests in Latvia. And I definitely got it here. Hopefully someday I'll get to come to Latvia and explore the woods myself, and I'll probably never come out because I'll be snatched up by the fairies. We'll see. But thank you so much for watching. If you learned a cool fact today, give this video a thumbs up and let me know what it was down in the comments. If you enjoyed this style of content, please consider subscribing, as this is an ongoing series on my channel. And next we're going to be heading over to Liechtenstein, my first video in that area since I did the whole history of Liechtenstein. And it's a really weird place. The exclaves of this region are larger than the actual region, which I don't know if there's many places in the world like that. Very off, but Liechtenstein is one of those places that's just unique and really doing their own thing. It's a fun place. So be sure to subscribe so you won't miss out. I hope that you found this video relaxing and educational, and I hope that you have a good night.